2 days after signing the deed. I drove back to my land. 20 acres of abandoned dairy farm by Crystal Lake. Mine. Legally. Officially. Finally, mine. But when I pulled up to the entrance, a black SUV blocked the gate. 2 men in matching polo shirts stood with arms crossed. The shirts said, Lakewood Estates HOA Security. Behind them, a brand new sign, Private Property Authorized Personnel Only. On my land. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Because what I discovered next changed everything. The grass had been freshly mowed. Tire tracks cut across the field. Orange stakes marked a boundary line that did not match any survey I had ever seen. 20 years as a real estate attorney taught me one thing. When someone plants a sign on land they do not own, they are hiding something much bigger. The black SUV blocked my entrance like a statement. 2 men in matching polo shirts stood in front of it, arms crossed, faces blank. The shirts read, Lakewood Estates HOA Security. Behind them, a sign I had never seen before, Private Property Authorized Personnel Only. I cut the engine and sat for a moment. Processing. 48 hours ago, I had signed the deed to this 20-acre parcel. Abandoned dairy farm, Crystal Lake frontage. No liens, no encumbrances, no HOA covenants anywhere in the title search. Yet here were 2 strangers guarding the gate, like they owned the place. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Because what I discovered next changed everything. I stepped out slowly, scanning the property beyond the guards. The grass had been freshly mowed, cut in neat rows that stretched toward the old barn. Tire tracks pressed deep into the soft earth, leading toward the lake. Orange survey stakes dotted a line running east to west. But the placement was wrong. I had studied the official plat map for weeks before closing. These stakes sat nearly half an acre inside the actual boundary. Someone had moved the line. Someone wanted this land to appear smaller than it was. The taller guard walked toward me, one hand resting on his radio, his posture radiating the kind of confidence that comes from never being challenged. Sir, this is private HOA property. You need to turn around and leave. I held his gaze without blinking. The deed recorded 2 days ago says otherwise. Nathan Cole. Check with your Mr. Hughes. The name came out as a test, and the guard's micro-expression confirmed my suspicion. Hughes, the man giving orders. The guard recovered quickly. I don't know what kind of paperwork you think you have, but this parcel has been under Lakewood management for 15 years. Mr. Hughes handles everything related to this land. I suggest you leave before this becomes a legal matter. He delivered the threat like a script he had memorized. I had heard variations of it 1,000 times in my career. 20 years of real estate litigation teach you to recognize a bluff. These men had no badges, no legal authority, no right to be here. They had only the assumption that I would back down. I pulled out my phone and began documenting. The sign, the SUV and its plate, both guards, the misplaced stakes, the mowed grass, the tire tracks. Each photograph is another piece of evidence. What do you think you're doing? The tall one demanded, stepping closer. Due diligence, I replied, still focused on the screen. You might want to hold that position. It'll make the trespassing complaint easier to illustrate. He stopped mid-step. The second guard shifted uncomfortably by the SUV. Neither had expected resistance. The tall one made a phone call, his voice dropping too low to hear clearly, though I caught fragments. Claims he has a deed. Should we call the sheriff? Understood. Holding position. He pocketed the phone and squared his shoulders. Mr. Hughes is aware. He recommends you consult an attorney before making any rash decisions. I almost laughed. Attorneys were my native language. Rash decisions were for people who did not know the system. I knew every filing deadline, every procedural loophole, every way to turn paper into power. If Garrett Hughes wanted to fight over land he did not own, he had made a critical miscalculation. I took one final look at the property stretched out behind the guards. The weathered barn, the glittering lake, the land I had purchased to build something new after decades of fighting other people's wars. Now, I was fighting my own. I climbed back into the truck and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, the two guards remained at their posts, protecting nothing that belonged to them. Tomorrow morning, the county recorder's office will open at 8. I planned to be waiting at the door. The county recorder's office occupied the ground floor of a limestone building that had survived 2 earthquakes and 100 years of bureaucratic indifference. I arrived 15 minutes before opening and waited on a wooden bench worn smooth by generations of anxious visitors. The hallway smelled like old paper, floor wax, and the particular staleness of government buildings everywhere. At exactly 8. Dorothy Mills unlocked the front door, a silver-haired woman with reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain and the unhurried movements of someone who had long ago stopped being impressed by urgency. She looked at me with weary patience. "You're eager," she said. "First one here in 3 weeks who didn't want a marriage certificate. What can I help you with?" I handed her a slip with the parcel number and asked for the complete chain of title going back to the original patent. She studied the number, then studied me over the rim of her glasses. "The Morrison Dairy property," she said. More statement than question. That one's been sitting quietly for a long time. "Are you the new buyer?" I confirmed. She nodded slowly, something flickering behind her eyes that I could not quite identify. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition of a pattern she had seen before. "Give me 20 minutes, she said, and disappeared into the archives. I waited at the counter, watching dust motes drift through the morning light slanting through tall windows. Somewhere in the back, I heard the rolling thunder of file drawers opening and closing. She returned with a folder thick enough to require both hands, dropping it on the counter with a solid thud. "Everything from 1891 to present," she said. "Original land patent, all transfers, any recorded easements or encumbrances. Knock yourself out." I spread the documents across the worn formica and began tracing the history of my land. The Morrison family had acquired the parcel in 1952 from a timber company that had logged it bare during the war. 3 generations had worked the dairy operation, expanding from 40 cows to nearly 200 at its peak in the 1980s. Then the slow decline, falling milk prices, children who moved to cities. The final heir, Eleanor Morrison, had passed away in 2008 with no surviving relatives. The property sat in probate limbo for years before finally being listed for sale. I examined every document twice, looking for anything that might explain the HOA's claim. No easements granting access, no conservation covenants, no deed restrictions, no transfers of any portion to Lakewood Estates or any homeowners association. The chain of title was clean and unbroken, a straight line from the timber company to the Morrisons to the probate court to me. Whatever authority Garrett Hughes believed he possessed over this land existed nowhere in the official record. Dorothy had been watching me work from her desk, pretending to sort mail while casting glances my direction every few minutes. When I finally looked up, she walked over and leaned against the counter, lowering her voice despite the empty office. "Find what you were looking for." "I found what isn't here," I said. "No HOA involvement, no easements, nothing connecting this property to Lakewood Estates." She nodded as if confirming something she already knew. "Funny thing about that parcel," she said, glancing toward the door. "Lakewood HOA filed an annexation application back in 2010. Big formal request to incorporate the Morrison land into their community plat as common green space. The board president came in personally, dressed like he was arguing before the Supreme Court. Very confident man." She paused, letting the moment build. County denied it flat. They had no ownership claim, no purchase agreement, No lease. Nothing. Just a request and the assumption that confidence would be enough. I asked if she still had a copy of the rejection. She smiled faintly and slid a single sheet from beneath the stack, as if she had been waiting for me to ask. Official county letterhead, dated March 15th, 2010. The language was direct and unambiguous. Application for annexation denied. Applicant Lakewood Estates Homeowners Association has failed to demonstrate any legal ownership interest in the subject parcel. No further action will be taken absent proof of valid title transfer or recorded easement. 15 years ago. This office had told Garrett Hughes in writing that the Morrison property did not belong to him. I photographed the rejection letter and added it to my growing file. Dorothy watched me with an expression I was beginning to recognize as quiet satisfaction. "I've been here 31 years," she said softly. "I remember when that man walked out of this building. He didn't look worried. He looked like someone who had just decided the rules didn't apply to him." I thanked Dorothy and headed back to my truck, my mind already moving to the next step. From the parking lot, I called the Lakewood HOA management office using a blocked number. A cheerful receptionist answered on the second ring. I told her I was relocating to the area and considering Lakewood Estates as my new home. "Oh, you'll love it here," she gushed. "Beautiful community, wonderful neighbors, and our amenities are second to none. The lakefront parcel is absolutely gorgeous. The board hosts summer picnics there, 4th of July fireworks, and even a little farmer's market in the fall." "It's been our community gathering space for years," I asked, as casually as I could manage, whether the lakefront land was officially part of the HOA. "Of course," she replied without hesitation. "Mr. Hughes secured it for the community back when the development was first established. It's one of our biggest selling points for new residents." Secured. I turned the word over in my mind after ending the call. Such a careful choice of language. It could mean purchased, leased, donated, or acquired through a legal agreement. But I had just reviewed every recorded document touching that property for the past 130 years. Nothing had been secured. Nothing had been transferred. Garrett Hughes had simply taken it. I drove past the entrance to Lakewood Estates on my way home, slowing near the stone pillars that flanked the main gate. A bronze plaque gleamed in the afternoon sun. Lakewood Estates established 2005. The same year. The Morrison patriarch had entered hospice care. The same year. The dairy operation finally shuttered. Hughes had watched a dying family abandon their land, waited until no one remained to object, and then absorbed the property into his community as if it had always belonged there. For 15 years, he had collected HOA fees for maintaining ground he never owned, hosted events on land that belonged to a dead woman's estate, and built his reputation as a visionary community leader on a foundation of quiet theft. No one had ever questioned it. No one had ever pushed back. I pulled onto the highway with the folder of evidence beside me. County records could prove the fraud, but exposing it would require more than documents. I needed someone who had witnessed the deception from inside. Someone willing to talk. Finding Frank Holloway took less than a day. Dorothy Mills had mentioned his name before I left the recorder's office, lowering her voice like she was sharing classified intelligence. "If you want someone who knows where the bodies are buried in Lakewood, talk to Frank Holloway. Retired engineer, lives on Pinewood Court. He's been asking uncomfortable questions at HOA meetings for years. Hughes hates him." I found his address through public property records and drove to Lakewood Estates the following afternoon. A man in his early 70s answered the door, white hair cropped short, suspicion carved deep into the lines of his face. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying," he said, already moving to close the door. I introduced myself quickly, told him I had purchased the Morrison dairy property, told him about the security guards, the signs, the threatening letter. His hand stopped on the doorframe. "You bought the lakefront parcel legally with a recorded deed." I showed him the document on my phone. He studied it for a long moment, then stepped aside. "You'd better come in. We have a lot to talk about." His living room was neat and spare, decorated with framed photographs of bridges and dams from his engineering career. He gestured toward a worn leather couch and disappeared into the kitchen, returning with 2 glasses of iced tea. "I've been waiting a long time for someone like you to show up," he said, settling into an armchair across from me. Frank had moved to Lakewood Estates in 2006, 1 year after the development opened. He remembered when Garrett Hughes first announced that the community had acquired the lakefront property. Big presentation at the annual meeting, slides showing the land, plans for picnic areas and a boat launch, and projections about increased property values. Everyone applauded. Hughes stood up there like a conquering hero. I asked if anyone had questioned the acquisition. Frank let out a bitter laugh. I did. Asked to see the deed, the purchase agreement, anything. Hughes said the paperwork was being finalized, soon turned into months. Months turned into years. Eventually, he stopped pretending to answer and just shut me down. Called me a troublemaker, undermining community spirit. "Did anyone else push back?" I asked. Frank's expression darkened. "Margaret Sullivan, widow on Oakdale Drive. She served on the finance committee and started asking where the money was going. The HOA was collecting $60,000 a year for lakefront maintenance, landscaping, security, events. But Margaret couldn't find contracts, invoices, anything showing where those funds actually went." He paused, staring into his iced tea. Hughes destroyed her. The first violation notice came a week after she started asking questions. The mailbox is 2 inches too close to the curb. Then unapproved garden decorations. Then her paint color was suddenly non-compliant. Garbage cans are visible for 20 minutes too long. The fines stacked up. After 18 months, she sold at a loss and moved away. He set down his glass. She wasn't the only one, just the most visible. Anyone who asks the wrong questions gets the same treatment. When I asked if Frank knew how to reach Margaret, he hesitated, then pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. "She's in Riverside now. We exchange Christmas cards. I can give you her number, but I should warn you, she doesn't like talking about what happened." I told him I would be respectful. He wrote the number on a scrap of paper and handed it over. "One more thing," he said as I stood to leave. "Hughes keeps records, obsessively, meeting minutes, financial reports, correspondence, everything. He thinks documentation protects him." Frank smiled grimly. "But if someone got access to those files, I suspect they'd find enough to bury him. Locked cabinet in the HOA office. Patricia Whitmore has the key. She's been Hughes's loyal soldier since the beginning." I drove away with Margaret Sullivan's number in my pocket and a clearer picture of what I was facing. Hughes had built something more sophisticated than a simple land grab. He had constructed a system. Intimidation to silence critics. Paperwork to create the illusion of legitimacy. Loyal lieutenants to guard the gates. But systems have structural weaknesses. They rely on no one ever looking too closely. I pulled into a gas station and dialed Margaret's number. She answered on the 4th ring, voice cautious and guarded. "Mrs. Sullivan, my name is Nathan Cole. Frank Holloway gave me your number. I just bought the Morrison Dairy property." A long pause on the other end. Then, quietly, "I wondered when someone would finally come back for that land." I gripped the phone tighter. "I need to know what you saw, and I need to know what you can prove." Margaret Sullivan lived in a small apartment complex on the outskirts of Riverside, 2 hours from the home she had been forced to abandon. I made the drive the following Saturday, bringing copies of the key documents. She met me at the door with the cautious body language of someone who had learned not to trust easily. Mid-60s, gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, eyes that assessed me for a full 10 seconds before she stepped aside. "Frank vouched for you," she said. "That's the only reason you're standing here." Her apartment was modest but immaculate, filled with photographs of grandchildren and a small garden visible through the sliding glass door. She gestured toward a kitchen table already set with 2 cups of coffee. "Show me what you have." I placed the county's denial letter in front of her. The document that proved the HOA knew in 2010 they had no claim to the Morrison property. She examined it with the methodical attention of someone who had once served on a finance committee, her fingers tracing the date and signatures. When she finished, she let out a long breath and set it down carefully, as if it might burn her. "March 2010, she said quietly. "I was still on the committee then." Hughes stood in front of us that same spring and said the acquisition was almost finalized. "Legal review," he called it. "Just a few more weeks." She looked up at me, something cold settling behind her eyes. He had this letter in his hand when he said that. He knew it was over, and he lied to our faces anyway. I asked her about the money. Frank had mentioned $60,000 annually for lakefront maintenance. Over the years, that totaled nearly $1 million collected from residents for property the HOA never owned. Margaret nodded slowly. "That's why I started asking questions. The budget showed line items for landscaping, security, and event coordination, professional numbers, official categories. But when I requested the actual invoices, Patricia Whitmore told me the records were confidential board materials. I filed a formal request under our bylaws. She ignored it. I filed again. That's when my mailbox was suddenly 2 inches out of compliance. She stood and walked to a filing cabinet in the hallway, returning with a manila folder thick with documents. "I kept everything. Not the violation notices. You don't need those. But this." She slid the folder across the table. "This is what got me driven out." Inside were budget summaries from 2011 through 2013, the years Margaret had served on the finance committee. Each document showed the same pattern. Lakefront maintenance is allocated as a separate line item, distinct from general groundskeeping. Security services are listed under a vendor called Dalton Property Management. Event coordination fees are paid to the same company. I flipped through the pages, watching the numbers repeat year after year. Dalton Property Management, $42,000 in 2011, $45,000 in 2012, $48,000 in 2013. I looked up at Margaret. "Victor Dalton, the vice president." She nodded grimly. His company, his invoices, his approval, all rubber-stamped by Hughes and Whitmore without any competitive bidding, any outside review, any oversight whatsoever. The implications were staggering. Hughes had not simply stolen land. He had monetized the theft, creating a pipeline that funneled homeowner fees directly into the pockets of his inner circle. The lakefront property served as justification for an entire category of spending that benefited no one except the people controlling the budget. Every resident who paid their quarterly HOA dues had unknowingly subsidized a fraud. "Did you report this?" I asked. Margaret laughed bitterly. "To whom the board controlled everything. The management company answered to Hughes. I talked to a lawyer once, but he said I'd need access to the actual contracts and bank records to prove anything. Without subpoena power, I was just a troublemaker with theories." She reached back into the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, handwritten, creased from years of handling. Then I found this in my mailbox the night before I decided to sell. The note was unsigned, written in careful block letters on plain white paper. 6 line items from the HOA budget, each flagged with a question mark. Lakefront Security Services, Dalton Property Management, $42,000. Below that, a single sentence. "Check the vendor registration. DPM was incorporated 3 months after Hughes became president." I stared at the words, feeling the weight of what they implied. Someone inside the HOA had seen what Margaret saw. Someone had tried to help her. Anonymously, at considerable risk. "Do you know who wrote this?" I asked. Margaret shook her head. "I've wondered for years. Someone on the board. Maybe. Someone in the office. Whoever it was. They were too afraid to come forward openly. That tells you everything about how Hughes runs things. Then I photographed every document in the folder, my phone capturing each page with clinical precision. The budget summaries, the vendor payments, the anonymous note. Margaret watched me work in silence, her coffee growing cold on the table. When I finished, she reached into her filing cabinet one more time and handed me a USB drive. Small and unremarkable. Every email I sent and received during my time on the committee, she said. Board communications, budget discussions, my requests for documentation, all of it. I made copies before I left because I knew someday someone would need them. I pocketed the drive. This is more than I hoped for. I'm going to make sure the truth comes out. Margaret held up her hand. I don't need revenge. Mr. Cole, I stopped being angry a long time ago. I just need someone to finally say out loud what everyone has been afraid to admit. That's all I ever wanted. And the drive back to Crystal Lake took 2 hours, but my mind made the journey in minutes. Racing through the connections faster than the highway miles disappeared beneath my wheels. The county denial letter proved the HOA knew they had no claim. Margaret's documents showed systematic financial fraud. The anonymous note suggested at least one insider understood the corruption and wanted it exposed. Victor Dalton's company had received hundreds of thousands of dollars for maintaining property the association never owned. Patricia Whitmore had guarded the records like state secrets, and Garrett Hughes had orchestrated all of it, silencing anyone who asked questions, driving out anyone who got too close to the truth. I had enough now to file criminal complaints for trespassing and fraud. I had enough for a civil suit that would expose the financial improprieties. But I wanted something more. I wanted Hughes to face his community. I wanted the residents of Lakewood Estates to see exactly who had been leading them for nearly 2 decades. I pulled into my rental as the sun dropped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the gravel drive. Inside, I spread Margaret's documents across my desk alongside everything else I had gathered. The folder was thick now, heavy with evidence. But evidence alone would not be enough. Hughes had survived for years by controlling the narrative, by making sure his version of events was the only one residents ever heard. To break that control, I needed a stage. I needed witnesses. I needed him to stand in front of his community and defend the indefensible. I opened my laptop and navigated to the Lakewood Estates website. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for the 3rd Saturday of next month, open to all residents and, according to the bylaws, any party with a legitimate property interest in matters affecting the community. I had a legitimate interest. I owned 20 acres that Hughes had been stealing from for 15 years. I sent an email to the board secretary requesting time on the agenda. Subject line: Lakefront Property Ownership Clarification. Let Hughes wonder what that meant. Let him spend the next 4 weeks trying to figure out how much I knew. The meeting was 32 days away. I intended to be ready. The next 4 weeks became an exercise in controlled patience. I spent the first week organizing my evidence into a coherent timeline, cross-referencing dates and documents until every connection was airtight. The county denial letter from 2010. Margaret's budget summaries show payments to Dalton Property Management. The anonymous note points to Victor Dalton's company registration. Email threads from the USB drive revealed how Patricia Whitmore had stonewalled every request for financial transparency. Each piece reinforced the others, building a picture of systematic fraud that had operated unchallenged for nearly 2 decades. I created 3 copies of everything. One for my files, one for the sheriff's department, one for the presentation I was preparing for the annual meeting. Hughes had built his empire on the assumption that no one would ever connect the dots. I intended to draw the lines in permanent ink. During the 2nd week, I filed a formal trespassing complaint with the county sheriff's office. Deputy Reynolds, a square-jawed man in his 40s with the patient demeanor of someone who had seen every kind of property dispute imaginable, reviewed my documentation with professional thoroughness. The deed, the chain of title, photographs of the security guards blocking my entrance, the sign claiming HOA authority over land they did not own. "This is pretty clear-cut," he said, flipping through the pages. "They've been using your property without permission. That's trespassing." I asked if he could attend the HOA meeting scheduled for the following month. He raised an eyebrow. "You expecting trouble?" I told him I was expecting the truth to come out, and that truth might not be welcomed by everyone in the room. He nodded slowly. "I'll have a deputy there, unofficially, just in case things get heated." The third week brought an unexpected development. Frank Holloway called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice tight with barely contained excitement. "Something's happening inside Lakewood," he said. "Hughes called an emergency board meeting last night. Closed session. No residents allowed. Patricia Whitmore left early, looking like she'd seen a ghost, and Victor Dalton hasn't been answering his phone for 3 days." I asked Frank what he thought it meant. "I think they know you're coming," he said. "Someone must have told Hughes about your agenda request. He's circling the wagons." I smiled into the phone. Circling wagons was a defensive posture. It meant they were scared. Scared people made mistakes. "Keep your eyes open," I told Frank, "and be ready. The meeting is in 10 days. During the 4th week, I received 2 pieces of communication from Lakewood Estates. The first was a formal letter from Bradley Thornton, the HOA's attorney, informing me that my request to speak at the annual meeting had been denied. "The agenda has been finalized." The letter stated, "No additional items will be considered. Furthermore, as you are not a resident of Lakewood Estates, you have no standing to participate in community governance proceedings." I read the letter twice, then set it aside. Thornton was wrong about my standing. California Civil Code Section 4925 guaranteed open access to HOA meetings for any party with a legitimate interest in matters under discussion. I owned property that the HOA had been illegally occupying for 15 years. My interest was not just legitimate, it was the most legitimate interest in the room. The second communication arrived 3 days before the meeting. An email from an address I did not recognize. Sent at 2 a.m. No signature, no greeting, just a single paragraph. "Hughes is planning to announce the sale of the lakefront parcel at Saturday's meeting. He's claiming the board voted to divest the property to avoid ongoing maintenance costs. The buyer is a shell company registered to Victor Dalton's brother-in-law. They're trying to bury the evidence before you can present it. The financial records are in Patricia Whitmore's office. Second filing cabinet, bottom drawer. The key is buffered under her desk." I read the message 3 times, memorizing every detail. Someone inside the HOA was feeding me information. The same person who had sent Margaret the anonymous note years ago, perhaps. Or someone new. Someone who had finally decided that silence was no longer an option. Either way, the message confirmed what I had suspected. Hughes knew I was coming, and he was trying to cover his tracks. I spent the night before the meeting reviewing my presentation one final time. 32 slides, each one building on the last. The chain of title proves the HOA never owned the land. The annexation denial proves they knew it. The budget documents show payments to Dalton Property Management. The vendor registration proves Victor Dalton had created the company specifically to receive HOA funds. Margaret's emails show how questions were suppressed. Frank's testimony about the original announcement. Everything organized, documented, and undeniable. I loaded the presentation onto a USB drive and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Then I made one phone call. Deputy Reynolds answered on the second ring. "Tomorrow," I said. "I have reason to believe they're going to attempt a fraudulent property transfer during the meeting." I need you there. A pause on the line. I'll have 2 deputies outside and 1 inside. Plain clothes. You sure about this? I looked out the window at the darkness beyond. Somewhere across that darkness. Garrett Hughes was preparing his own strategy, confident that his control over Lakewood Estates would protect him, as it always had. He was about to learn otherwise. I'm sure, I said. It's time to end this. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of autumn day that made the lake shimmer like hammered silver. I dressed in a charcoal suit, the same one I had worn to 100 courtrooms over my career. Professional, serious, ready for battle. The Lakewood Estates Community Center sat at the heart of the development, a sprawling building with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the manicured grounds by the time I arrived. The parking lot was already half full. Word had spread that something significant was happening at this year's meeting. I recognized Frank Holloway's truck near the entrance. Beside it, an unmarked sedan that I guessed belonged to one of Reynolds' deputies. I parked at the far end of the lot and sat for a moment, feeling the weight of what was about to happen. 15 years of lies. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were stolen. Families are driven from their homes. Today, the truth would finally have its day. I stepped out of my truck, tucked the USB drive into my pocket, and walked toward the entrance. Hughes had built his kingdom on stolen ground. It was time to watch it crumble. The community center hummed with nervous energy as I stepped through the double doors. Rows of folding chairs filled the main hall, nearly every seat occupied. I counted over 150 residents, more than triple the usual attendance, according to Frank. They sat in clusters, whispering to neighbors, glancing toward the front, where a long table had been set up for the board. Garrett Hughes occupied the center seat, a silver-haired man in his late 60s with the practiced smile of a politician and the cold eyes of a predator. To his left sat Victor Dalton, rigid and pale, avoiding eye contact with anyone. To his right, Patricia Whitmore shuffled papers with trembling hands. Bradley Thornton, the attorney, sat at the far end, a leather briefcase open beside him. They looked like defendants waiting for a verdict they already knew was coming. I found a seat near the back, next to Frank Holloway. He leaned over and whispered, "Hughes has been watching the door since it opened. He knows you're here." I nodded, but said nothing. Let him watch. Let him wonder. The USB drive sat heavy in my jacket pocket. 32 slides waiting to reshape everything this community believed about their leadership. A plainclothes deputy I recognized from my meeting with Reynolds stood near the emergency exit, arms crossed, expression neutral. Another waited outside, visible through the window. The stage was set. Hughes called the meeting to order at exactly 10 o'clock, his voice projecting confidence that did not reach his eyes. "Welcome to the annual meeting of Lakewood Estates Homeowners Association. We have a full agenda today, so let's proceed efficiently." The first 40 minutes crawled by. Budget approval, committee reports, landscaping contracts. Each item was delivered in the same droning bureaucratic tone, designed to lull the audience into passive acceptance. I watched the residents around me, saw the glazed expressions, the checked phones, the stifled yawns. This was how Hughes maintained control, not through force, but through boredom. By making governance so tedious that no one paid attention to what was actually happening. But today, attention would be unavoidable. At 10:45, Hughes cleared his throat and straightened his papers. "We now come to a special announcement regarding community property." The energy in the room shifted. People put away their phones. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. "After careful consideration," Hughes began, "the board has voted to divest the lakefront parcel from our community holdings. Maintenance costs have become unsustainable, and we believe the funds can be better allocated elsewhere. A buyer has been identified, and the transfer will be completed within 30 days. He smiled benevolently. This decision was not made lightly, but it represents the best path forward for Lakewood Estates. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Frank shot me a look. This was the cover-up the anonymous email had warned about. Hughes was trying to sell property he did not own to a shell company controlled by his own allies. Bury the evidence, pocket the proceeds, maintain the illusion of legitimacy. I stood up before he could move to the next agenda item. Point of order. My voice cut through the murmurs, sharp and clear. Every head turned. Hughes's smile flickered. "I'm sorry. This is a closed meeting for residents only," he said, the warmth draining from his tone. "You'll need to leave." I walked toward the front of the room, ignoring him. California Civil Code Section 4925 guarantees open access to HOA meetings for any party with a legitimate interest in matters under discussion. I reached the projector setup beside the board table. "I have a very legitimate interest. I own the lakefront parcel you just announced you're selling." The silence that followed was absolute. 150 people holding their breath. Hughes's face cycled through confusion, anger, and something that looked almost like fear before settling into a mask of composure. "That's absurd," he said. "That property has been under HOA management for 15 years. We have documentation." I plugged my USB drive into the projector. "So do I." The first slide appeared on the screen behind the board table. The official county plat map, showing Lakewood Estates' boundaries, and beside it, the Morrison Dairy parcel, clearly separate, never connected. "This is the official boundary of Lakewood Estates," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. "The lakefront property has never been part of it, not when you established this development in 2005, not when you filed an annexation application in 2010. I clicked to the next slide. The county's denial letter filled the screen. "And not when the county rejected that application because you had no ownership claim whatsoever." The murmurs returned, louder now, tinged with confusion and the first stirrings of anger. Hughes gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. "This is outrageous. You're disrupting official proceedings with fabricated—" "I'm just getting started. Mr. Hughes." I clicked to the next slide. "And I suggest you remain seated. The next few minutes are going to be very uncomfortable for you." Said the denial letter hung on the screen like an accusation. 150 residents stared at it, reading the county's words for themselves. "Application for annexation denied. Applicant has failed to demonstrate any legal ownership interest in the subject parcel." The date stamped at the top, March 15th, 2010, 15 years ago. This room's leadership had been told in writing that they had no claim to the lakefront property. They had proceeded anyway. Hughes recovered faster than I expected, rising from his seat with manufactured indignation. "This document proves nothing. The county made an administrative error that was later corrected. Our legal counsel can confirm." He turned to Bradley Thornton, but the attorney was already closing his briefcase, his face carefully blank. Thornton understood what was happening. He wanted no part of it. I clicked to the next slide. "Let's talk about what happened after the county rejected your application." And the screen filled with a screenshot of an email, the sender's name highlighted in yellow. Garrett Hughes to Victor Dalton, March 20th, 2010. I read it aloud for those in the back. "The annexation request was denied. The county says we have no ownership claim. But I don't see why that should stop us. We'll just treat it as ours. By the time anyone notices, it'll be too late to do anything about it." The room erupted, voices overlapping, questions shouted, accusations flying. Hughes pounded the table. "That email is fabricated. This man is a fraud, trying to steal community property." But the residents were no longer looking at him with trust. They were looking at him with doubt. And doubt, once planted, grows fast. I waited for the noise to subside before continuing. Mr. Hughes is partially correct. Someone in this room is a fraud, but it isn't me. I clicked to the next slide. Budget summaries from 2011 through 2013. Line items highlighted in red. For the past 15 years, this HOA has collected approximately $60,000 annually for lakefront parcel maintenance, landscaping, security patrols, and event coordination. The money came from your dues. Every quarterly payment you made included a portion allocated to maintaining property the HOA never owned. I paused, letting that sink in. 15 years, $60,000 a year. The math was simple enough for anyone to calculate. Nearly $1 million, taken from residents, for a lie. But where did that money actually go? I clicked again. Invoices from Dalton Property Management filled the screen. These are payment records showing funds transferred to a company called Dalton Property Management. $42,000 in 2011, $45,000 in 2012, $48,000 in 2013. I turned to look directly at Victor Dalton, who had not moved since I began speaking. His face had gone from pale to ashen gray. Dalton Property Management was incorporated in 2006, 3 months after Mr. Dalton joined the HOA board. The registered agent is Victor Dalton. The company has no employees, no equipment, no physical office. I let the silence stretch. It exists for one purpose only: to receive money from this association. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Residents turned to stare at Dalton, their expressions shifting from confusion to fury. A woman in the front row stood up and pointed at the board table. "You've been stealing from us for 15 years. Dalton opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again. Nothing came out. Hughes tried to regain control. "These accusations are baseless. We will not allow this meeting to be hijacked by—" But his voice was drowned out by the rising tide of anger. Frank Holloway stood and addressed the crowd. "I've been asking questions about this for years. Every time I brought it up, Hughes shut me down, called me a troublemaker. Now we know why." I clicked to the next slide. Margaret Sullivan's email correspondence, preserved on the USB drive she had given me. In 2012, a resident named Margaret Sullivan began asking where the maintenance money was going. She requested invoices, contracts, and documentation. Her requests were denied. I scrolled through the emails, letting the timestamps speak for themselves. Request submitted, request denied, request resubmitted, denied again. Within weeks of her first inquiry, Margaret Sullivan received her first violation notice, then another, then another. 23 violations in 18 months, fines totaling over $4,000. I looked at Hughes. She sold her home and moved away. She wasn't the only one. Anyone who asked questions received the same treatment. Harassment disguised as enforcement. Silence was purchased through intimidation. And a man near the middle of the room stood up, his voice shaking with anger. "My wife wanted to join the finance committee 3 years ago. She asked about the lakefront budget at her first meeting. The next week, we got a notice saying our fence was 2 inches too tall. We've been fighting violations ever since." Another voice from the back. "The same thing happened to us when we questioned the security contract." Then another, and another. The stories poured out, years of frustration finally finding expression. Hughes no longer tried to interrupt. He sat frozen, watching his carefully constructed world collapse around him. I clicked to the final slide. My deed, recorded at the county recorder's office, shows legal ownership of the Morrison Dairy parcel, 20 acres, including the lakefront. This property belongs to me. It has never belonged to Lakewood Estates, and effective immediately. Anyone who sets foot on it without my written permission is trespassing. I turned to the plainclothes deputy near the emergency exit. He stepped forward, badge now visible on his belt. "Additionally, I've filed formal complaints with the county sheriff's office regarding criminal trespass and misuse of association funds. Deputy Reynolds and his team are prepared to take statements from anyone with relevant information." The deputy nodded and produced a small notebook. "We'll be outside when you're ready to talk." The room dissolved into chaos. Residents surrounded the board table, demanding answers. Patricia Whitmore burst into tears and fled toward the back exit. Victor Dalton remained seated, staring at nothing, a man watching his future evaporate. Bradley Thornton had already disappeared, his empty chair a silent testament to how quickly loyalty evaporates when the ship begins to sink. Only Hughes remained at the table, his silver hair disheveled, his practiced smile replaced by something raw and desperate. He looked at me across the crowd, and for a moment, I saw the calculation behind his eyes, the search for an angle, an escape, a way to spin this catastrophe into something survivable. He found nothing. I unplugged my USB drive and slipped it back into my pocket. The presentation was over. The evidence was public. 150 residents now knew the truth about the man who had led them for 15 years. Whatever happened next was out of my hands. The aftermath unfolded faster than anyone anticipated. Within 72 hours of the meeting, the county sheriff's office had opened a formal investigation into Garrett Hughes, Victor Dalton, and Patricia Whitmore. Deputy Reynolds called me on the third day with an update. "Whitmore came in voluntarily," he said. "Started talking before we even finished reading her rights. She's been carrying this for years, apparently. Couldn't wait to unload." Patricia had provided access to the locked filing cabinet in the HOA office, the one the anonymous email had mentioned. Inside, investigators found 15 years of financial records, contracts, and correspondence that painted a detailed picture of systematic fraud. Dalton Property Management had received over $700,000 since 2006. Not a single legitimate service had ever been rendered. The company existed on paper only, a funnel designed to convert homeowner dues into personal profit. The criminal charges came down 6 weeks later. Garrett Hughes faced 3 counts of fraud, 2 counts of embezzlement, and 1 count of criminal conspiracy. Victor Dalton was charged as a co-conspirator, with additional counts related to the shell company he had created. Patricia Whitmore received reduced charges in exchange for her cooperation, her testimony forming the backbone of the prosecution's case. She revealed details that even I had not uncovered. Hughes had pressured her to falsify financial reports for over a decade. When she had expressed reservations, he had reminded her that she had signed off on the fraudulent budgets. She was complicit, he told her. If he went down, she would go down with him. Fear had kept her silent, until it hadn't. The plea negotiations took 4 months. Hughes's attorney argued for leniency, citing his age and years of community service. The district attorney was unmoved. In the end, Hughes pleaded guilty to 2 counts of fraud and 1 count of embezzlement in exchange for the remaining charges being dropped. The judge sentenced him to 3 years probation, 400 hours of community service, and full restitution of $280,000 to the Lakewood Estates Homeowners Association. He was also barred from serving on any HOA board or community organization for life. Victor Dalton received a similar sentence, with an additional requirement to dissolve Dalton Property Management and surrender all assets obtained through the fraudulent contracts. Patricia Whitmore, in recognition of her cooperation, received 18 months probation and was required to complete an ethics course for financial professionals. The civil consequences proved equally severe. Frank Holloway organized a group of 37 residents who filed a class action lawsuit against the former board members, seeking recovery of the misallocated maintenance fees they had paid over the years. The case settled out of court for $420,000, funded primarily by Hughes's personal assets and a directors' and officers' liability policy the HOA had unknowingly maintained, each participating household received an average of $11,000. For many, it was the first tangible proof that their years of suspicion had been justified. Margaret Sullivan joined the lawsuit from Riverside, her testimony providing crucial evidence of the harassment tactics used to silence critics. When the settlement check arrived, she donated her entire portion to a legal aid organization that helped homeowners fight HOA abuse. "I don't need the money," she told me over the phone. "I just needed someone to finally tell the truth." The social reckoning was perhaps the most complete. Hughes sold his home within 2 months of the sentencing, unable to face neighbors who now understood exactly who he was. The moving truck arrived on a Tuesday morning, and according to Frank, not a single resident came out to say goodbye. Victor Dalton and his wife relocated to Arizona, their departure hastened by the cold silence that greeted them at every community function. Patricia Whitmore remained in Lakewood Estates, a diminished figure who kept to herself and avoided eye contact at the mailbox. The residents did not harass her, but they did not forgive her either. She existed in a kind of social purgatory, tolerated but never trusted. The HOA itself underwent a complete transformation. A new board was elected, composed entirely of residents who had never served under Hughes. They hired an independent management company with no ties to any board member. They implemented transparent financial reporting, with quarterly statements available to every homeowner, and they formally acknowledged, in a resolution read aloud at the first meeting under new leadership, that the lakefront parcel had never belonged to Lakewood Estates, and that the previous board had deceived residents for nearly 2 decades. I watched all of this from a comfortable distance. The retreat center I had planned for the Morrison Dairy property was finally taking shape, the old barn converted into a workshop space, the pastures restored to native grasses, and a small dock extending into Crystal Lake where I could sit and watch the sunset. Frank Holloway stopped by most weekends, bringing beer and local gossip and the quiet companionship of someone who had waited a long time to see justice done. One evening, as we sat on the dock watching the light fade over the water, he asked me something he had been holding back for months. "Did you ever figure out who sent those anonymous tips the note to Margaret? The email warning you about the cover-up?" I shook my head. "I have suspicions, but no proof. Whoever it was took a real risk. They wanted the truth to come out, but couldn't afford to be identified." Frank nodded slowly, staring out at the lake. "Maybe that's how it should stay. Some people do the right thing without needing credit for it." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the water lap against the dock pilings. The sky turned orange, then purple, then deep blue, scattered with stars. Somewhere across the lake, the lights of Lakewood Estates glittered through the trees, a community slowly healing from wounds it had not known it carried. I thought about Garrett Hughes, serving his probation in some other town, stripped of the power he had accumulated over 2 decades. I thought about Margaret Sullivan, finally vindicated after years of exile. I thought about all the residents who had paid their dues in good faith, trusting leaders who betrayed them at every turn. "You know what I've learned from all this?" I said finally. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Possession isn't ownership. Confidence isn't authority. And paperwork beats presence every single time." Frank laughed and raised his beer. "I'll drink to that." We clinked bottles as the last light faded from the sky. The land beneath us was finally, truly mine. Not because I had fought for it, but because the truth had always been on my side. I had simply been patient enough to let it speak.